How often do you think about those serving in our military? Unless you have a friend or a family who's on active duty, it's probably not very often. Perhaps like me, when you hear about the news of another bombing in the Middle East somewhere, you pause and say a silent prayer for those serving in our seemingly never-ending wars there. But when you see the local news coverage of a submarine recruit crew returning from extended deployment, you pause and reflect on how hard that life must be. Especially those pictures of new fathers holding infants, some are several months old for the very first time. Most of us have no idea what this lifestyle must be like. And even myself, although I was in the Navy for almost a decade, and I did 2 complete 7-month-long deployments on board aircraft carriers, I have no idea what that's like. Our 2 daughters were born after my Navy days at sea were in my wake, so to speak. In fact, before we got married, my wife Laura told me I could either have a military career or kids, not both. That was wise advice. Laura was speaking from experience since her father had been a U.S. Air Force officer, and she had recently completed her active duty service as an Air Force officer. So she knew what she was talking about. As a veteran, when I first heard that the theme of this Laity Sunday worship service would be community service and our veterans, I was immediately supportive. As a faith community that emphasizes being grateful, it is appropriate that we devote a Sunday to reflecting on and being grateful for those who serve and are serving. I think most of us would agree we are rather insulated from the military in Glastonbury. We do not have many members or neighbors who are on active duty or even in the reserves. Very few of our youth today choose to join the military. Of course, there are some exceptions, such as Andy Bedard, who just recently completed his basic training in the Marine Corps, and Katie Green, who is currently an officer in the Army and just returned from duty in Afghanistan. She's hiding in the back with us today. Thank you for your service, Katie. I love that our young service members are often in our books of joys and concerns. And I love that we have a candle in the sanctuary, a flame that burns to remind us of our service members every Sunday. So when one of the deacons, Cheryl Edison, called me and asked me if I could give a sermon on my military service, of course, I hesitated. Really? We need a sermon on my military service? I know there are members of this congregation who have served much longer than me, those who have been in combat. Technically, I'm a veteran of the so-called First Gulf War. That was the one back in 1991. Since I was in theater during that conflict 2 different times. However, I was actually not in any combat, so I don't really feel qualified to speak as a veteran relative to many others. But who can say no to Cheryl? Actually, Cheryl didn't really have to twist my arm, because reflecting on it, I realized that my military service had had a significant impact on my life, and this was a good topic for a sermon type of talk. Of course, immediately after I said yes, I regretted it. Here I am again, speaking publicly on something emotional. You'd think my term as president of this church would have cured me of that disease. So let me start with why I actually decided to join the Navy in the first place. But before I did that, I need to provide you with some background on my view of the military, which has evolved with time but has always been rather complex. I would say ambivalent. How can it be any other way? This is an organization whose mission is to fight war, which means inevitably killing people. However, mankind is not perfect, far from it. There are serious misunderstandings, there is evil, and totally unacceptable injustices prevalent in our world. These are some of the simple reasons why we need a military. The Bible actually has quite a lot to say about war and fighting. Today's first scripture reading is one of my favorites, in part because this passage has been set to music. You may have recognized it as the lyrics to Turn, 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 or there is a season. Maybe that's why it's called Turn, Turn, Turn. This song became a hit in the mid-1960s after the Byrds recorded it during the peak of the Vietnam War. It was actually written in the 1950s by Pete Seeger, a famous folk singer, who just passed away this past January. Unfortunately, there is a time for war and a time for peace. And although I pray for peace, and I certainly wish that we could put an immediate end to our current wars, I doubt that this time is anywhere near. In our gospel scripture this morning, Jesus states that in this world, his followers would fight to prevent his arrest. Then he says, but my kingdom is not of this world. My personal interpretation of this text is that even though Jesus teaches us to pray that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven, this world is not heaven. It will never be perfect, and fighting is our innate response to injustices here on earth. And as long as there is fighting on earth, there's a need for the military. In summary, I view the military kind of like insurance. I wish I didn't have to buy insurance, but that's totally unrealistic. Stuff happens. That's what we say in the military. Well, actually, we say something a little more colorful. But I can't say that from up here in the pulpit. You know what I mean? But when stuff does happen and you need your insurance policy, you sure hope and pray that you have an excellent one. That's why we need an excellent military. I wish I could say that I ultimately joined the military for some altruistic reasons. However, I have to admit that it was primarily just selfish reasons. Sure, there was an element of patriotism. I love America. I'm proud of what America stands for. But in the end, I really just decided that flying airplanes on and off ships would be a lot cooler than being an engineer. And I wanted to see the world. So I quit graduate school, which had been my previous method of procrastinating starting a real job. And I signed up to be a naval aviator. I think my dad thought I was nuts at the time. But I was certainly not what you would call a gung-ho military man. However, my service gave me a much greater appreciation for the military. For example, during my first 7-month deployment, we made multiple port calls in the south of France. That was great. And whenever we were in the uniforms, all the elder French men and women wanted to buy us drinks. This was the summer of 1990, 46 years after the liberation of France in World War II. Yet this victory was still so important to these grateful people that they felt the need, I would actually say they felt compelled, to thank us as surrogates for the country that had done so much for them so many decades ago. A few of them even told us their personal stories about the war. Looking at their faces when they described the liberation, it made me really appreciate how important this military victory was to their lives. Sure, I had studied World War II in school like all of you, but for the first time I really began to appreciate how important the U.S. military was to the history of Europe. To this day, I feel a need to buy a drink for every World War II vet I meet. I tell them, essentially, you guys bought us, and my squadron makes a lot of drinks in France, so I owe you. My military service also taught me to better appreciate what's required to actually accomplish such important victories. It takes practice, lots of practice doing inherently dangerous things. The flight deck of an aircraft carrier is truly an amazing place. Planes are launched and recovered at a dizzying pace in a very, very small space. An aircraft carrier may be an awfully large boat, but I can tell you it's a very, very small airport. It's even more amazing when you realize that the average age of the sailors working on that flight deck is 20 years old. Whenever I stepped out onto the flight deck, my primary goal was just to jump inside the plane's cockpit as soon as possible. You could find yourself being blown sideways by jet exhaust with no notice. All I can tell you is that watching these kids work 12-hour shifts in that incredibly dangerous environment made me realize that there is no way you can pay someone to do that kind of work. They had to be motivated by something else. And they were proud to be part of this impressive and powerful operation, and they were also proud to be serving their country. Of course, the flying part could be dangerous as well. During the last phase of my flight training, I lived in a house with 3 of my fellow flight students. All 3 of my former roommates were killed in naval aircraft accidents. I can tell you fun stories about all 3 of my former amigos. But you can tell actually I cannot. I can't even do it over a cup of coffee without crying. It's just so sad. Instead, I'd like to simply emphasize that all of these aircraft accidents occurred during peacetime operations. Ironically and sadly, although I'm the only survivor of the 4 of us, I'm technically the only war veteran of the 4 of us. Stuff happens, unexpected stuff. These experiences taught me that you can really not know something unless you actually experience it. This is not to say I don't enjoy learning about other things, I do. But it made me realize what a huge difference there can be between learning and doing. I thought I knew quite a bit about the U.S. military, but I really had no idea. I had no idea how important it could be, not just to Americans, but to others all over the world. Nor did I have a real understanding of how incredibly hard it could be. This is why I'll never know what it's actually like to be a new father who does not get to hold your baby until it's 3 or 5 months old. Now let me turn to how my service impacted how I view our country. First, my military service provided me with my first real interactions with people from all over our great country, from all different backgrounds. For example, I learned that some of the guys in the maintenance divisions that I led had never experienced 3 square meals a day until they were in the Navy. I gained a much better appreciation for the broad diversity of American people. However, what substantially changed how I viewed our country was some of my unique experiences overseas. By far the most foreign experience I had was when I was deployed to the Persian Gulf. Unfortunately, the status quo there was, and still is, unfortunately, really a mess. There always seems to be some war underway over there. Car bombings are a regular occurrence, and most of the governments are extremely oppressive. I flew over the oil well heads that had been set on fire by Saddam's retreating forces. And I saw other environmental disasters associated with the oil business almost everywhere we went. It was in the Persian Gulf that I first really started to appreciate the total price we pay for our addiction to fossil fuels. I had grown up breathing smog in LA, but this directly exposed me to some of the other unsavory aspects of our status quo energy business. My viewpoint is that we are essentially funding both sides of the so-called war on terror. In summary, spending time in the Persian Gulf provided me with additional motivation to work on alternative energy. This is why I actually returned back to grad school at Berkeley. Geographically, I just did a full circle back to the same place before I even joined the Navy. However, I had really changed. I had a much greater sense of purpose and a passion for what I wanted to work on as an engineer. But alternative energy is not what I want to talk about today. And for those of you who know me, you don't want to get me started on that topic. Another thing I found very disappointing in the Persian Gulf was that in the few instances we did have port calls in an Arab country, I did not actually have any opportunities to meet the Arab people. This was because almost all the merchant classes were foreigners. For example, at the hotels, the restaurants, the shops in the United Arab Emirates, you would meet people from India, from Pakistan, from the UK, from the Philippines, almost all over, but not any Arabs. You'd see the Arabs drive by in their nice cars, but I didn't actually meet any of them. This all became clear to me when I got to spend some time working with about half a dozen officers from the Royal Saudi Air Force. I was sent ashore to Saudi Arabia during a brief joint training exercise. This provided me with an opportunity to work alongside these Saudi men. Yes, they were all men. They were also all college educated, and I learned the reason they were officers because they were of an elite class. They were all members of the House of Saud, which essentially means they were distant relatives of the King of Saudi Arabia. They were not royal enough to have a really cush or powerful government job, but if they completed the requisite training, they could be an Air Force officer. This included training with the United States Air Force. So they'd all spent some time, at least some time in Texas, as well as some other U.S. locations. A couple of them had even attended college in the States. They were all very proud of their excellent educations, and they were all excellent English speakers. I found I liked hanging out with these guys. There was a lot of downtime between the training exercises, so we spent a lot of time talking. I found that these Saudi gentlemen had a bit of a philosophical bent. They really enjoyed discussing the myriad of differences between our two very different cultures. I was somewhat surprised at hearing what they thought of America, which most of them portrayed as a place rampant with both sex and violence. This seemed to be motivated by Hollywood movies. When I asked them to compare this to their actual experience in the States, they agreed, well, it was not like the movies. They attributed this dichotomy to where they'd been in the U.S. They were sure that Los Angeles and New York City must be crazy. There must be crimes occurring in every street corner. I assured them this was not the case. I tried pointing out to them that Texas is one of the most gun-friendly states in our union, and yet all their experiences have been quite peaceful. They weren't buying any of it. It seemed there was a deep-seated mythology about America and Saudi Arabia, and they could not accept that it was not true. I also took the opportunity to ask them about some of my perceptions of their culture. My favorite was when I asked them about how women were treated. I asked them very politely, why were women allowed to drive? And why was their dress code so incredibly strict? I found the responses most interesting. They were adamant that Saudi women had lots of power, especially in the Saudi household. They provided me with this example. In a traditional Saudi home, the man is not allowed to enter any room except the living room and his own bedroom without the wife's permission. So essentially, a Saudi wife can prevent her husband from seeing his own children. I was not too swayed by their arguments, but I could clearly see that what they felt their society practices were totally justified, maybe even superior to other cultures. And another thing that was clear to me, that these were very intelligent and good-hearted men. They loved their traditions, and they were very comfortable that they made a lot of sense. The proof was how safe and stable Saudi Arabia was. To them, cutting off thieves' hands and political opponents' heads was not too large a price to pay for a low crime rate in a stable society. I witnessed that life in Saudi Arabia and some other places as well is very different than ours. I found aspects that I liked in some of these foreign cultures and other things that I did not. However, I realized some of my likes and dislikes were just personal preferences, which were formed in part by my life experiences. Here again, although I could imagine what it might be like to grow up in the Saudi culture, I could never really know what it's like. One simple way of summarizing this is that my experiences actually taught me that Thomas Jefferson's famous dictum, all men are created equal, is inherently flawed. A much better dictum would be, all people, not men, all people are created wonderfully diverse. Especially if you follow that up with the great equal rights verbiage, and we're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In short, what I have found to be self-evident is this: we are all wonderfully diverse, but all equal in the eyes of God. So you can see I gained a number of important things from my Navy service, including my willingness to openly criticize our nation's awesome founding fathers. But isn't this part of what makes America great? I attained a much greater appreciation for both our military and for our country. I also gained a much greater sense of purpose in my professional life. I got valuable leadership experience. And most important of all, I started to truly appreciate the diversity of both different people and different cultures. In closing, I'd like to briefly relate how these experiences have influenced the way I see and interact with South Church. A favorite military joke is that the word Navy is actually an acronym. It stands for Never Again Volunteer Yourself. But the Navy actually taught me that the opposite is true. I witnessed firsthand that people who feel they are doing something for a higher purpose are willing to work very hard and accomplish amazing things. As Margaret Mead famously said, never underestimate the power of a small group of committed people to change the world. In fact, it is the only thing that ever has. South Church is that kind of place. This community has done and is doing some incredible things. And if you really want to know what this faith community is doing, then just volunteer. Become more engaged. I have found the more I learn about this church, about what our members are doing and have done, the more impressed I truly am. I truly believe that Glastonbury and some other places as well would be much different if South Church didn't exist. I love that South Church is a missions church in so many different ways, but I especially love the youth mission trips because both my daughters and I have gone on some of these trips. These trips expose our youth and the advisors to very foreign worlds and very different people. Sure, they're in the U.S., but we go to places that are much different than Glastonbury, and we have fully engaged experience with some of the folks there. These trips do not have to be long. A week-long, completely different experience can be truly transformational. I only spent 1 week with my Saudi friends. These experiences do change lives, and more often than not, the light that is dramatically changed is the one doing the serving, not the one being served. If hearing my Navy stories makes you wish that you had done some military service, then do some mission service. You can skip the boring months at sea part and go straight to the impactful stuff. If you cannot go, then be sure to ask those who went for their favorite story. You'll have a chance tonight at the Youth Missions Toss to Supper. Finally, I also love that this church meets people wherever they are in their faith journey. Although we have a covenant that summarizes our common beliefs and what binds us together, we are also open to those who have very different beliefs than ours. I personally think that every person's faith journey and their understanding of God is totally unique. And I thank God for such a wonderful diversity of spiritual beliefs. I love that Reverend Allen even has an annual class called Nights with Nicodemus, where you're invited to write your own personal faith statement. This is a great experience. I highly recommend it. Feel free to write your own personal Declaration of Independence if you're so inclined as well. So thank you all for your attention this morning. I'd like to thank the deacons for organizing this special Laity service, and thank you for inviting me to preach. I'm actually glad that I agreed to do it, even if the actual delivery part is kind of hard. Lastly, I'd like to thank all the veterans in our congregation, both those who are here and those who came before us. Please be sure you thank veterans on Veterans Day whenever you can. I know that it may feel inadequate for what some of them have done for us, but I can assure you that most of them do not expect anything. And a thank you really means a lot. Unfortunately, I know that when people thank me, sometimes my response is often dismissive. Sometimes I even say something like, thanks, no big deal. But the reason I say that is because I spent a lot of time on Veterans Day thinking about my former roommates who made the ultimate sacrifice. And by comparison, my service was nothing. But in reality, it was a big deal to me, and I can only hope that I can live my life in a way that honors their service. I'd like to ask all the current and former military members to please stand if you can and raise your hands so we can acknowledge you. Your service, and now you guys know who you can thank after the service. God bless all our military members who are currently serving. My hope is that their service will impact their lives in a very positive way, as it did for me. Maybe someday they'll also be able to say, thanks, it was no big deal. But it will be a big deal in so many ways, some of which they won't fully realize until somebody asks them to give a sermon about it a couple decades later. Thank you.